Let's dive into the world of African philanthropy. Hello, and welcome to Driven's Fundraising Superheroes podcast. I am your host, Sabrina Shishente, and Driven is a leader in nonprofit technology. We help nonprofits unlock the true potential of their data using our all-in-one software. We cover everything from member, volunteer, and donor management, and would love to talk to you about your fundraising goals. So give us a visit at trustdriven.com to learn more. We can learn a lot from African giving behaviors. The concept of Ubuntu means I am because you are, which at its core is the spirit of philanthropy. There is a duality to giving, the informal and the formal, and Africa chooses to focus on the concept of Ubuntu, caring for each other and giving what you can to support your community. Mide Akerewusi is an experienced fundraiser, leader, and founder of AgentsC. Their latest report, titled The Duality of Giving, explores the trends and motives of African philanthropy. And I'm so excited to have Mide on the show today to talk about the research and what we can learn from Ubuntu and the duality of giving. So thank you, Mide, for joining me today.
Thank you, Sabrina, for having me.
Can you start off by explaining to our audience the concept of Ubuntu and at its essence, what does it mean? What does it mean to you?
For sure. The term Ubuntu actually is derived from the Zulu language and culture and tradition. And it essentially means that I am because you are. And at the essence of that, I guess if we were going to translate that to a Western context, it means that I am my brother's keeper, or I am my sister's keeper. And it means that we're all responsible for each other and should love each other at the same time. What it means to me as a fundraiser is that I think in Western terms, it's probably the closest we can get to the concept of what we would call philanthropy. Mm-hmm. So we see that there is a close connection between the concept of Ubuntu, I am because you are, and philanthropy, which is in the Greek language termed as the love of humankind. And so they both concepts speak to the innate responsibility we have to take care of each other.
Yeah, at its essence, I mean, that's what philanthropy really was. It wasn't until I actually went to the talk that you guys had before the report launched that I really thought about it as more of a human neighbor helping neighbor perspective. When I pictured philanthropy in the past, I always thought about it as big checks and tax write-offs and kind of the top 1% giving to other people. I never thought like me helping out somebody in my community could be considered philanthropy, but at the end of the day, that's what it really is.
I think what you say is correct. I think we have been conditioned to think that philanthropy is what happens when rich people write large checks. And to a certain extent, that's one dimension of philanthropy. But if we were really to break down philanthropy at a community level, at a level that has meaning to people like you and I, and perhaps people listening in to this show, I think what philanthropy means is that we understand that we have this responsibility for each other. And sometimes that means that we need to give of our finances, give of our time, and share the talents that we have so that others may benefit. And I do think that with the focus on what we call major gift philanthropy, we lose so much of the original alchemy, so much of the original intent of Ubuntu and philanthropy. And what we want to do actually is bring that back into focus. What happens when everyday people do phenomenal things to help their neighbors or people overseas? That too, for me, is philanthropy.
Yeah, and what I really appreciated about the duality of giving is you actually started it off talking about your personal experiences, growing up with your mom and her practicing Ubuntu like within her community and teaching you what philanthropy really means. So I thought that was a really beautiful way to start the report. But speaking of that report, how did it even come to be? Where did the concept of it begin? Why was it important for you to make this?
It of course started with my mother. My mother has taught me so much of what I now know about philanthropy. And she never once sat me down and said, hey, here are the principles. She was far more powerful in her demonstration of philanthropy by actually showing me what it means to love and care for and share your resources with other people. So I remember as a kid, I'd go off to school in the morning, I'd come home, and there'd be a stranger sleeping in my bedroom. And I'd rush downstairs and say, hey, to my mum, like, who is this person, this strange person in my room? And she'd say, oh, that's Mrs. So-and-so. She's going through a hard time at the moment. She's currently homeless. She needs a place to stay. So she's going to be in your room. I hope that's okay. Welcome to the couch kind of thing. But I've also witnessed, as I say in the Duality of Giving report, my mother just having this big heart to be able to send money back home to Nigeria to her relatives so that they could pay for healthcare and education and buy items that were important for her to survive. So that was the beginning, I think, for me, of my journey into philanthropy. As I became a professional fundraiser over 25 years ago, what I was amazed by was the fact that philanthropy was only ever defined in the terms of a rich white man, middle class or upper class in the UK, who, out of the many things he did with his life was to take 10 seconds out to write a check to an organization. And that filled me with a lot of curiosity. And then I started to research philanthropy itself. Where does it come from? What is its history? And how is it practiced amongst people like me, Black people of African origin? And so the idea of the research, I would say, was crystallized as early as about 2004 when I started to teach fundraising practice. And I would always, within that practice, embed a shout out, a recognition, an acknowledgement to the fact that people of African descent are as active in philanthropy as white middle class men. It's just that it's translated slightly differently.
Yeah. And I think that the report does a great way of showing that. The statistics for me, as somebody who knew nothing about African philanthropy, were really comforting to know that, there's still a place that practices it based on community. And I think it's also really important to note because often, here in Western culture, you see commercials, you see kind of like the white savior concept of people going into Africa and helping them. And it's often not discussed about, okay, what are the communities, what are the nonprofits actually in the continent that are doing that work? So I think bringing light to the industry in the continent is a really great way to open that conversation about, actually having communities support themselves.
Absolutely. And, when you develop a passion, the thing I love most about passion is that when you develop a passion, you realize that actually your passion is also a phenomenal building block to building community. So what happened when I started to be passionate about African philanthropy, I saw that there were some other people who also were passionate about the subject. And so in 2018, a guy called Atlahang Matlala, who was working at Doctors Without Borders, Southern Africa at the time, approached me and said, hey, let's work together on building a spotlight, shedding light on philanthropy on the African continent. And it was a passion of mine and a passion of his. And so we then set about thinking about, well, how would we start this? And we felt that research was primarily what was lacking. We had a lot of anecdotes. We could see some stories on the African continent of African people being philanthropic, both in a traditional sense and in a more formalized sense. And we then decided that actually, probably the best thing we could do is to research what we were seeing on the African continent as far as philanthropy was concerned. And that's how the research came. So it was we spent 1 year doing the research of among 325 people on the African continent. And then it took us another year to write and design the report itself.
It is really beautifully done, and you guys did a great job at making sure to cover all aspects. What I found really interesting about the findings of the report is that there seems to be a more personal aspect to the art of giving. The Western world often promotes giving with tax write-offs. We see a lot of marketing, a lot of corporate responsibility emphasized. What you guys found is that giving is often chosen like through family members, friends. They seem to have a lot of trust within the opinions of people close to them. Why do you think that there is a continued emphasis on that community aspect?
I think philanthropy starts in the heart and spreads to a neighbor and builds into a community. And then, you know, it's a bit like that tiny spark that rages as a forest fire over time. And so where we are now in this trajectory is that people of African descent are well alert and engaged with their responsibilities to give to friends as well as to family. That's always been part of the African tradition. Ubuntu encapsulates that so well. What it means in the modern context, though, is that there are also Africans in the diaspora. And the premise is that those of us in the Western world, those of us who are of African descent in the Western world, will always look to Africa or the Caribbean or South America, where our home countries are, and ask ourselves the question, what can we do to help? Now, much of the answer to that question is captured through what we would call overseas remittances. So that's the act of taking some of our pay and sending it back home in the currency of our home countries. And that is very well documented. What isn't so well documented is the impact of that. So the impact that Black people themselves have on building their own communities. And if you look at the stats, you'll see that overseas remittances far exceed international development assistance, aid, or any level of giving from a Western charity to a Southern country. And that's the reality, that people in the global South are actually far more powerful in promoting the economies of the countries that they originally come from than international development organizations. However, place-based philanthropy, so that is if you, for example, are an international development organization, the premise that you have is to ask somebody in the West to fund a program or a project in the global South. Now, that will always happen, kind of always has been part of the fabric. But what we're missing out on is actually the ability to engage people within those countries in formal acts of giving. And what we expose in our research is that there's phenomenal potential on the African continent for philanthropists there to be engaged with international development agencies in the work that they do. That's on the first hand. And then on the second hand, for us in the diaspora, as we are sending money home through remittances, we are also thinking about our local community and how we might help people, for example, here in Toronto, where I am, how I might help nonprofit organizations here as an African person through donations that I wish to give to registered charities here. And we found that it was not actually mutually exclusive. Africans had this phenomenal, sophisticated methodology of being able to give very locally to causes that they were passionate about, friends and family meets in their needs, but also structurally through formalized philanthropy directed to registered charities. So that's where the term duality comes from. It's this description of traditional Ubuntu matched with formalized philanthropy.
Yeah, there's this really big divide, I feel, especially in my community, which is also Toronto, between formal and informal giving. I think that there's a really big emphasis here on the formal aspect of giving. as that is what I mainly experience when I'm doing donations. It's always for big campaigns, and again, like the big tax write-off aspect of it. But when you guys were going into the nitty-gritty of the communities within this study, you found that there's a really big emphasis on generosity, especially on the informal aspect of giving, deciding to help people, maybe in kind or with time. Do you feel that Western philanthropy can benefit by adopting some more of the philosophy that you found in the study? Were you surprised by the outcomes at all?
I was surprised by the outcomes. I was surprised by the high level of trust that particularly South Africans have for nonprofit organizations. 96% of the 301 South Africans that we surveyed expressed that they had a high degree of trust for nonprofit organizations. I've actually done some work on trust and confidence in nonprofit organizations in the Western world. And the most that we were able to see was about 70% of donors trusting the organizations that they give to. So I think that's a measurable difference. I would say more generally, what we see is that people from the global South, and certainly in our research of African philanthropists, when it came to giving, they essentially looked at the whole pie in terms of what they had and were giving as a result of everything. Whereas in the South, what we see is that people, whereas in the North or in the Western world, what we see is that people give out of their surplus. So that is, I pay my bills, I get all the necessary expenditures done, and then I ask myself, of what is left, what will I give to charity? Amongst Africans, that's not the way we do it. As soon as that paycheck comes, we kind of realize that we are obligated to give from our paycheck first, and then figure out how we manage the rest of our finances from there. And I think that's something that in the Western world or in the global North, we can definitely borrow from this kind of selfless giving, giving without restriction, being generous to a fault, just like my mother is and was.
Yeah, that we do tend to miss that selfless generosity. When you were speaking, it reminded me of my great grandmother, who we're from Italy. So she was from a very small town in Sicily, and this was back in like the early 1900s. And a lot of mothers, they couldn't provide milk for their kids, so she would provide breast milk for all the little babies in the town, which is such a weird concept to think, especially now that so much has changed. But when you're living with almost nothing, I remember my mother would ask her, like, why would you do that? And she's like, that's just what you did. Like, when you saw people in need, you helped. You gave whatever you could give. And it's such a simple concept that it gets so complicated over time, because like you said, we only give in surplus now. When people ask us for something, we don't say, oh yeah, that's what I do. We say, oh, let me check.
Yeah. And it's really funny because as you were speaking about, it was your great grandmother.
Yes.
It took me back to John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath. I haven't read it in many decades, but I think that's actually how that novel ends, with a mother breastfeeding a child that is not hers. And of course, the story is about the Great Depression in the USA during the 1920s or thereabouts. But the humanity is what I think you're speaking about. When humanity comes into our line of sight, so little other things matter, right? Convention goes out of the window. I would say restrictions become limitless. And that's what you're speaking about. And that's the type of philanthropy that I think is so meaningful, that it's just given straight from the heart. And so the concerns around, well, if I give, how much will I have left, hardly come into the equation, because what you're really looking to achieve is to reflect a humanity, to reflect your humanity. So when it comes to giving, you're actually giving as much as you can. give. You're not thinking or calculating in your mind. So if I gave this proportion, what would that mean for my tax write-off? You're thinking, if I give to Mide, how much more improved will his life be? And if I gave Mide more, just how might that be transformational for him? So I'm a strong advocate for giving from the heart. And I see that's what we, I would suggest that throughout our research, that was one of the things that impressed me the most, that all of our philanthropists and donors just had this incredible passion to give from the heart. And because of that, we were able to capture some remarkable stories and sound bites from them, and see what African philanthropy really is all about.
Exactly. You have an incredibly established career as a fundraiser. You've worked with some incredible organizations. In the launch of the Duality of Giving, Andrew Chenal mentioned that we are working off a Canada that once was. He said a lot of amazing things that resonated with me, but this was the one that resonated the most. Why do you think there is such a resistance and reluctance to change, to reflect the Canada that is now? How can we challenge this bias that is often in a lot of organizations still?
Yeah, I think it's a phenomenal question, and I think Andrew has a very remarkable point there. Mm-hmm. I say to my clients often that, listen, you have a fundraising goal and a fundraising target, and truth of the matter is, you've been reaching those goals and targets working exclusively with one type of donor, and that is, a white donor whom you presume to have wealth and is giving you money. But the landscape in Canada is changing. Immigration, certainly in Toronto, has now brought us to a situation where over half the people in this city are people of color, and we or new immigrants. And we have to ask ourselves, as fundraisers and as nonprofit organizations, what are we doing to engage new Canadians and people new to Canada in this phenomenal act of generosity when it comes to giving? What systems, processes, people, strategies have we put in place to engage people who don't look like us, who have a different culture to us, but actually who are very much like us in their spirit of wanting to give and to build and strengthen communities? And I would say that I think as fundraisers, we've done a very poor job of trying to engage people of various and different cultures and religions. And that needs to change.
It does, 100%. When I was interviewing Sabine Sumar a few months ago, she worked with Ryerson, and she actually did a research study on the demographics of board directors, and they found that I think it was less than 15% were people of color. The women's statistics were going up, but there was still a big gap there. And in Toronto, especially, I looked up the statistics, and like you said, it was 50%. So it's really weird that there's this gap in the reflection of nonprofits, especially a place that's supposed to serve the community. It's not, looking like it's community.
It's not looking like it's community, but let's remember, what gets measured gets done. So it's time for us to actually start to put targets in place for reaching diverse communities, for building partnerships, for establishing connections with people of various cultures within this city or any other city across Canada. It's time that we started to measure the impact of what we do as far as engagement is concerned. I think nothing will change unless we begin to figure out what change looks like and start to work towards it.
Thank you so much, Mide, for coming onto the show. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. And for those listening, I've linked AgentsC and the Duality of Giving report in the description box. You can also find links to all of our social media there to stay updated on everything driven and fundraising superheroes. We post regularly and offer a lot of resources for those working in the nonprofit sector. We'd also really appreciate it if you can like and subscribe so you're getting updated on all of the newest episodes. We have a lot of exciting guests lined up for the show, so definitely consider subscribing. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time on Fundraising Superheroes.